Jari, let's start with trying to recollect how you came into the World Bank to work on the prototype carbon fund and what later became the carbon finance unit.
Okay, so I joined back in September 2000 at basically the first organizational meeting of the prototype carbon fund. So prior to that, I was in Finland in the government, in the Ministry of Environment for a few years. And during the Finnish EU presidency, I worked in the EU Commission, and I was selected for that position by Pauli Mustonen, who was one of the prototype carbon fund founding fathers on the donor side. And when I returned from Brussels back to Helsinki, Finland was joining the PCF and wanted to send someone from Finland to work in the team, and I was lucky to be selected. So I recall vividly coming to the meeting and meeting Ken for the first time, Ken Newcomb, our manager, and the rest of the team. So that's how I ended up here, and ended up staying also much longer than initially anticipated.
Because this is the first time we're getting a chance to recollect Pauli Mustonen. You know, he was, as you say, one of the founding fathers and a supporter of the PCF.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about him. You know, he was, I very fondly remember him,
yeah.
And the tragedy of his not staying on till to see the full result of this whole carbon business.
Right. I mean, I guess he was truly an international person and very much believer in cooperation between countries and in the development cooperation overall and climate change. And a very, very friendly and warm person, as you know, and very strategic. He saw the Prototype Carbon Fund as a very important initiative and for Finland to join it. And in order to make the Kyoto Protocol not one-sided but a true cooperation instrument as well. And as you know, he didn't necessarily say much, but when he said something, he meant it, and it said something valuable that contributed to the discussion and took it forward. And ever a diplomat as well. Yeah. As you recall, he perished in Nepal in his job and doing what he loved.
Yeah, it was a sad time when we all heard about his death in the crash in Nepal, but he was a special person.
For sure.
So going back to the time of your coming to the Prototype Carbon Fund unit, what are your earliest recollections of working in the team?
Right. Well, I mean, we were some of the very few first team members. You had already worked on it for several years prior to that, but when I joined, there were just, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 team members, and Ken, a very tight-knit, innovative and excited team, really feeling that we are creating something new, and as we went along, basically. And we had a lot of brainstorming. You know, we had team meetings at least 3 times a week for hours on end. We would talk around the table and figure out the best way to take the initiative forward and contribute, you know, to the Kyoto Protocol process. We probably come back to that, but we created a lot of the firsts in terms of methodologies and processes and monitoring and verification and all the good stuff that really needed to be put in place. So it was a very, very nice team, small team, and of course it grew then over the years fairly rapidly, but it was like a small family and very exciting time.
And among the projects, what are the earlier ones that you can remember and about the clients as well.
Right. Well, as you, we started the PCF portfolio pipeline. We tried to have a diverse group of countries, diverse types of projects, and start working on them in advance of the regulatory framework being in place. I mean, you had Kyoto Protocol and you had the articles there and some negotiation text, and then trying to navigate that. So a lot of the early years were just trying to put forward approaches and methodologies. So I was working initially, as far as projects go. I did some capacity building and that kind of training work as well, but as far as projects go, some of my first ones were in the Clean Development Mechanism in Brazil,
Yeah.
Landfill gas projects. We tried to do some biomass projects as well. So those were the first projects that I worked on, and working with the clients was also new for me, to be directly interacting with both government and private sector participants or counterparts. And it was a lot of fun. Of course, there were difficulties in trying to understand their points of view and what they were expecting from us, and commercial terms and all the formal requirements, letters of approval, etc. So it was a lot of fun. Then I started working on some other projects in Central America, and then joint implementation projects in Central and Eastern European countries. So gradually started working on other projects there as well. Energy efficiency, district heating, even geothermal in Poland. So it was, I think intentionally we tried to have as wide a range of projects as possible so that we could contribute the most to the process.
So I very vividly remember the landfill gas project in Rio,
right.
and
Yes.
the challenges there with the commercial entity,
Right.
the intermediary,
Right.
and not so much with the entity who was actually implementing the project.
Right, right.
In those early years, was it difficult for the bank to interact with the private sector, or what was it that made that particular project a challenge?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was more challenging than some of the other ones. I'm sure there were a lot of other tricky ones. I think for the bank as an institution, maybe it was a little bit difficult because we were interacting directly with the private sector, which we don't necessarily do so much in other lines of business of the bank, while also working with the government in the same project for approvals and other things that are part of the process. I guess it was, and then we were dealing on the donor side. We were in the PCF already. We had both governments and private sector, which had sometimes very different angles to things. I mean, the overall objective was for everybody to try to, okay, let's try this out, let's do it for real. But governments maybe had more of a strategic view and the overall climate convention process in mind, whereas some of the companies were very acutely aware that they have to comply with Kyoto Protocol under their regulations and regimes. So sometimes there was a little bit of tension on that. Okay, what are the commercial terms? How quickly can we deliver the credits? And then on the project sponsor side, obviously, they, as a private sector company, often it was about, okay, when do we get the revenue? The uncertainty around revenue, and can they use it as collateral or a way to leverage other financing? I think that was part of one of the sort of ultimately a little bit disappointing things, that as it is a revenue stream and not highly uncertain, but there were lots of risks related to whether you could get the project registered, etc. It made it difficult for private sector to really count that cash flow as a revenue that they can build the project on, which then, trickled into the additional discussion: is this really making a difference or not? So it was there were so many angles and issues around everything that everybody has their own objectives and reasons for it, and different timelines and expectations. So it was a lot of management of relationships on all sides.
And perhaps in the earlier years, there was a little optimism on how easy or quickly all of this could be done, as a consequence of which I think people started to wake up to the realism and to the disappointment.
Right.
And that caused a lot of heartburn and difficulties.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, for sure on the team side, we were certainly couldn't wait for the first ones.
Yeah.
And I actually, that was one of the highlights of my early years here, that Brazil project was one of the first two CDM projects to get registered.
Yeah.
And that was a big
event.
Personal thing for me, and I think also for the team and for the whole system to finally get the first projects registered. And on that, just prior to that, there was a lot of back and forth on the letter of approval with Brazil, whether the government was willing to, or what kind of a letter of approval they were able to provide, given that Kyoto Protocol was not yet. I guess it was at that time. They must have been.
Yeah, I don't think it had entered into force. I think, and that was the major controversy or difficulty with Brazil, because the Kyoto Protocol hadn't entered into force.
Exactly,
they were unwilling to issue a letter on something which was not in force.
Right.
But that's
lots
a
of
long time ago.
around that. As well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the early years, where do you think the team was as its best in terms of innovation?
I mean, I think we had to innovate pretty much everything. But I think probably, obviously the methodologies. You will talk to Johannes. I think he was the guru on methodologies and getting those into the system and then taking forward to get them approved and trying to keep them robust and manageable. I think there was a lot of innovation around that, obviously. And then the other thing was the commercial contracts. What are the clauses that need to be in the contracts? How do you negotiate a price on something that is not tangible and there's no benchmark or market? What is a reasonable compromise? And obviously there was a lot of discussion on our role as that sort of broker there, whether we could be impartial and represent both sides' interests fairly. And then obviously, just since we are in the World Bank, all the internal procedures, how we would fit into those, because we were creating a new type of business line for the World Bank where we were actually basically procuring or purchasing credits, which the bank normally wouldn't do and still doesn't really in any other business areas. So we needed to also internally innovate a lot. And I think then the innovation was also to try to bring the two sides together and around the table and really work it out in real life projects.
In terms of the constraints or the institutional challenges, what are your most vivid memories of places where we were constrained by the institutional setup of the bank itself?
Well, of the bank itself, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, the fact that we were doing something that the bank doesn't normally do. We were negotiating a commercial contract and receiving something for it and channeling funds through our system from the donors. So I guess that was a big thing to figure those procedures and mechanics out, and reporting and accounting and all that. And it took a while. And then the other thing was obviously the all the safeguards requirements. How do they apply? And it was a new thing not only to us but for the bank as a whole. Then for our management in the country teams or sectoral teams to understand what the heck are we talking about here, and then trying to also see if we could work with bank lending operations, which was difficult, really was difficult because of the different timelines and cycles, and the fact that we were usually, especially in the early days, most of the projects were in the private sector, so they were not directly in bank projects otherwise. So I think those are some of the internal challenges. We were viewed as a little bit of a odd thing in the bank and as a team. And I think that also helped us because we were able to really move quickly and innovate and then go and say, okay, we have this thing, how do you put this into the bank systems? Which, caused a lot of friction or discussion as well, but ultimately became understood and became a valued part of the bank, role and business.
So, in terms of the impact that carbon finance had, the most dramatic ones typically tend to be in the landfill sector. And do you remember, or can you narrate the impact of carbon finance in the waste management sector in Rio, through the Novo Gerar project and the subsequent ones that SA Paulista, if I remember correctly, the name, right? How the impact it had overall, because it was for us for a long time a flagship product.
Right. I mean, given that you are dealing with methane, you get many more carbon credits, then the revenue is more concentrated and to some extent was easier to maybe predict and had a bigger impact than in their financing plan and consideration. And some companies, the brave ones initially, like SA Paulista and others, who started it, took some risk, obviously. They were able to put the financing together, but then see that they will get this revenue, and that helped them often move to a much higher level of sophistication of waste management, creating these new sanitary landfills, sealing them out, collecting the gas, using it for power or just flaring. So I think some of these companies were basically visionaries on their side and could see this revenue as a way to really develop their business and move that into a new era. And I think on the municipal side, often some mayors, of course, waste management is very important for voters and for the citizens. That they also saw it as a way to really step up the game, let's say, in waste management. So I think waste management certainly is one of those, small segments or sectors where the carbon credit payments really made a big difference. And there was no doubt clearly additionally that really this revenue that was coming in made a big difference in moving them into a new management practice.
Certainly, in the case of Brazil, where I think the municipal reforms had taken place and there was clear accountability and there was a tipping fee and a desire to address the solid waste management problem, I think can probably be regarded as one of the single most visible sign of the impact of carbon finance in terms of upgrading, as you described, the waste treatment, the sophistication of gas collection. I think looking back, that probably is one sector which was most directly impacted by climate finance.
For sure. I mean, this same company then went on and had several other landfill projects. And then we worked with some of the state banks to create program approaches to systematically go through the sector and bring in the benefit. So I think, absolutely, landfills or waste management is one of those sectors.
Sector,
and not
yeah.
only in Brazil,
Everywhere,
many other countries.
everywhere, yeah. And Brazil had the right institutional structure for it to benefit from it, and the private sector was there.
Right.
And I think Caixa is the bank you're talking about,
Right.
which then be systematically. So it is a good example of
Mm-hmm.
the actual concrete example of the benefits of carbon finance. Now, if I could shift a little bit to another place where I think you had a very, very direct impact on the Eastern European countries on looking at joint implementation and the whole process leading up to the green investment schemes.
Right.
Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. So, there were high hopes that joint implementation would be much simpler because it was under the country emission caps that these countries had. So, in principle, additionality should have been a little easier to establish because there was no risk of increasing emissions globally because that would be controlled by the cap. But since the cap was higher than the current emissions through that very complicated international process and some of the buying countries' concerns, a lot of the similar methodological issues did creep into, let's say, the joint implementation as well. But having said that, I think there were some cases where we were able to develop some robust but simpler approaches to get projects off the ground and get the emission reduction verified and monitored. There was a complexity then around the national registry systems that were part of the joint implementation system where you had country level registries rather than an international registry like in the CDM. So that was a particular issue or challenge there. But one example of, I think, where we created something new was in Czech Republic, where we had a program of small hydro projects through basically a state intermediary. And I think some of that learning then benefited the programmatic approaches in the CDM later on, but also kind of created the seed in our heads that, okay, how could we leverage the excess or headroom of assigned amount units that these countries had. So we came up with the concept of a green investment scheme where some countries on the buying side really were struggling with the targets. The CDM was not delivering enough credits for their compliance needs at the volume and speed that they needed. So we said, okay, let's look at a small fraction of the headroom assigned amount unit allowances, and some countries agreed, okay, we can buy some of these allowances or units, provided that you put it into a fund and then create a mechanism whereby you will screen proposals coming in and channel these funds to the eligible activities that further reduce the emissions. So we created this kind of a fund concept at that point. In Poland, Czech Republic, we worked with some other countries in advising them, Ukraine, other places. So I think that was an innovation certainly in itself, and I think hopefully will be remembered and will benefit some of the discussions going on now and going forward on how do you try to bring things to scale and aggregate projects, because the transaction cost of CDM and JI was just getting too high ultimately. So we needed to look at ways, okay, how do you bundle things together and create transparent criteria and processes to select the projects or finance these projects at the program level or country level.
And I think the particular relevance of the green investment schemes in the context of the Paris Agreement, where countries have a soft target, not
Right.
as hard a target as the Eastern European countries had, but certainly moving in that direction. The NDCs will take you in that direction. That will create an opportunity and a precedence and contractual frameworks which I think will benefit from the early years, where you put those kind of similar conditions in JI countries, right? Huh?
Right.
Again, the green investment schemes were rapidly kind of replicated by many others, investment banks and others who created funds as well. So looking back, that's probably one of the important contribution of the carbon business, I think.
Right, yeah, for sure.
So again, going back to the evolution inside the World Bank, from the prototype carbon fund to the new country funds that came in, what was your recollection on the way in which the business became more or less a credible, proper business inside the World Bank? In comparison to the early years in 2001-2, where it was definitely a boutique business in some corner.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we were able to demonstrate that it can be done, and we were credible, and the projects were credible. The World Bank has its global reach and convening power, so success created success, I guess, or results created results. And some of the donor countries or buyers, in particular, I guess, like Netherlands, Spain, Italy, others who really did see that they wanted to comply and needed to comply with Kyoto targets. Yet at the same time, the volumes that they were able to reduce domestically or source from projects on their own were not sufficient. So some of them really put a lot of trust on us and put a lot of resources for us, and it did scale up very quickly. But luckily we had a very good pipeline of projects, and we were able to, rise up to the challenge. And obviously our manager, Ken Newcomb and Odin and Joel and others really also did a fantastic job in managing that and also securing these resources. And obviously then when we were growing into 1 billion, 2 billion business, then also we got a lot more internal attention and also needed to mainstream our activities more into the bank's regular ways of operating.
And in your mind, what was the main constraint for us to not be mainstreamed with our own lending program? Why we relied so much on third-party projects, and what impact did it have on the credibility and the speed at which we grew, and on the transaction costs?
Right. Well, some of these projects were just the type that they were naturally in the private sector, so we needed to kind of go directly to the source. Some of them were also relatively smaller size projects, which may not be the big investment projects that the bank might have been financing. Some project types that the bank would finance would not necessarily fit into the emission accounting systems. For example, in many countries, the power sector, we do a lot of transmission and distribution projects, or we may have transport projects or energy efficiency projects, which were very difficult to get into that Kyoto Protocol eligibility stage. So the project types were sometimes a mismatch. And then besides the fact that we were often working with private sector innovative entrepreneurs, the bank typically obviously works with government institutions and companies which may be moving at a different pace, and the whole preparation of bank lending projects, for example, is at a different timetable than the carbon finance projects. Sometimes one is slower and then the other is faster, or the vice versa. And then it was a challenge to get into that bank project preparation stream early enough, and earlier years especially. Again, it was even for the bank teams and management. It was well, it's interesting, but what is it really going to bring tangible benefits to my clients? Is it just going to distract my dialogue? So for many good reasons, oftentimes we worked a little bit separately. But I think if there is a new vivid carbon market emerging, I think there's now so much more understanding and so much more emphasis on climate change mitigation also in the bank, that we might be able to work together more. And I know that our colleagues in carbon finance now are working on some programs like that together with lending operations.
Yeah, I think the other advantage is also that people such as yourselves have moved to the operational part of the bank over the last 15-20 years. So there's much greater level of awareness and understanding, and the clients are interested as well. And as you pointed out, I think our lending is much more amenable to the types of methodologies or accounting practice which would permit as we move to a Paris Agreement. No?
I mean, some of our own carbon accounting is based on CDM methodologies, essentially. So we have to do it, or we are doing it as a second nature now in some ways.
So in terms of the institution itself, how do you think it has evolved over the last 15 years? Is it now at a place, the bank, where this kind of innovation, this kind of new product or work on climate change is likely to be more productive, more innovative? Or do you see the institution still the same in terms of being very cautious about new ideas or new products?
I mean, I guess the bank is, to some extent, it's a big institution, and there's always some inertia and risk, low risk appetite sometimes. But on the other hand, I think the bank has really internalized climate change, in my view, to much larger extent than it was back in the early 2000s. I mean, a lot of was said and spoken about, but now it really is, at least in the energy sector where I work, it really is driving our work. And we look at climate co-benefits every single project very seriously. Okay, what is the benefit to the climate change mitigation or adaptation agenda of this project, and very consciously thinking through those things. So I think there's a lot more receptiveness to climate change and understanding of climate change. And as far as innovation goes, I think my sense is that in the last few years there has been a lot more openness to all kinds of innovation in the bank as a whole, not only on climate change, but financing structures and project structures and you name it, a lot more emphasis on innovation as such. So I think overall, and the agile initiative, trying to be more efficient and agile and quicker on our feet to get the benefits out to the clients. So I think overall, if we were to start the carbon finance business now, probably we might be in a little bit better position. And if there is new innovation needed, I think there's a bit more ability and receptiveness for that.
And in terms of banks' partners, both countries, particularly in Europe, and the private sector, and our donor countries, client countries. is your sense that the capacity also has risen to a totally new level, that you can have this kind of a discussion much more easily and with a much more receptive audience? And who would you say would be the key clients who we could partner with?
I mean, overall, yes. I mean, as you well know, the new initiatives are very much building on, in a way, from the developing country client side towards the developed countries or the demand. So I think the awareness, that's one of the big successes of CDM, is that it contributed to that awareness and capacity in the countries. Obviously, it varies from country to the next. The big countries like China, India, Brazil really dominated that Kyoto market in terms of supply. But I think across the board, the awareness is at a better level. Obviously, the capacity is still in many countries insufficient, and a lot of the bigger countries and middle-income countries are taking climate change incredibly seriously. It's for their economic development. It's the way to go. I mean, they see it, and it's benefiting them. So, and the NDCs are driving that process in many countries in a serious way. And in others, it may be a more of a thought exercise, but it is really changing the mentality and putting that issue on their maps. So in terms of the counterparts, I mean, the governments are now much more aware, and it's part of their policies, and they want to develop renewables, improve energy efficiency, or do better land management, forestry, transport. So I think climate change is so much more on everybody's minds that I think it's a better counterpart now to have a dialogue with. And then you have a lot of private sector companies who are building their business models in part on that basis. And financial institutions also are looking at opportunities to invest in clean technology. And so overall, I think it is a different world. Obviously, a lot more needs to happen and really fast, but at least there's been quite a bit of progress. And Kyoto Protocol was certainly a big contribution to that.
Yeah, as you say, the Kyoto Protocol and the activities by the bank and subsequently by the private sector, I think contributed a lot in getting the experience and bringing in the private sector into the whole space. So now, if we were to engage, I think there's a greater opportunity and a wider set of players. And in that context, in your mind, do you think the mechanism of engagement needs to be slightly different? I mean, in the 2000s, you had to go out and do everything, all the documents, all the concepts, all the methodologies. It was an institution like the bank which had the resources and the people which led that process. We don't have to do all the heavy lifting ourselves now. I think in your mind, would a partnership with the private sector, with some of the governments be much more effective? And is it happening in energy sector or lending that you're looking at, a wider set of players coming in from a climate consideration perspective?
Definitely. I mean, a lot of the renewable energy space is really driven by the private sector. With the costs of technologies coming down so rapidly, that really is giving them a good business opportunity. So there is a lot of interest in the private sector, in clean technology and ultimate climate mitigation as a core benefit of it. So I think given this willingness of the private sector to invest, then we can, that's a good counterpart to work with. But then the government obviously needs to be there to provide the right regulations and transparency and consistency of policy. So bringing those together, I think is key, and the bank obviously has a role there to play. And then it depends, if you're talking carbon markets specifically, then it really depends on where the mechanisms move towards. But a lot of the market may be actually in what we consider developing world, within those countries and emerging economies. Obviously China, India, others, huge countries, and can create their own market based mechanisms, and we are helping them put those systems in place. So it's a more diverse, and I guess a lot more bottom up building the market than the sort of framework was there for Kyoto, and then we started to trickle it down. Okay, what does it mean at the ground level? Now it's bubbling up from the other side a bit more.
So while trying to conclude a little bit, if you look back at your 18, 19 years at the bank, is there something you would have done differently?
I mean, personally, many things, of course. But I think, I hope that if a new market is emerging, and in the negotiations, some of the pitfalls of, making the perfect the enemy of good, if that can be avoided, and I think some of it can be avoided now that developing economies or emerging economies are taking on, even if they are soft targets, there's less of this concern that are we just moving emissions around. That should be in their minds, and an opportunity there. And in CDM, I sometimes said that you are guilty until proven innocent, and it took really a long time often to prove your innocence. So it was often frustrating, for good reasons, of course, but went a bit too far in some cases. I think we collectively felt that. So I think if that sort of ethos would be there, that would be good for the system. And then I think for the bank, we did our best, and I think we did quite well. So I don't know if there's any major things that we would do different or would need to do differently, other than obviously the changing landscape. We need and can work now much more directly with our clients in the client countries.
And any advice to the young people coming into the carbon business now, on how to think of their future and how to make decisions going forward? The young people are always smarter than us, so I don't know if I'm in a position to advise, but have fun and have some good luck, and don't get discouraged. You're doing something good for the world, and it's a good thing to do. And in a way, it was some of the best years of my career, obviously, because it was so new for everybody. So it was exciting to create something new. Good.